The United Nations Security Council has passed a resolution to implement an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during the holy month of Ramadan. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not happy. He skipped the delegation in Washington Monday because the U.S. abstained instead of vetoing the resolution. Here's State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller responding to the delegation's absence.
But the reason we didn't veto it is because there were also things in that resolution that were consistent with our long-term position. Most importantly, that there should be a ceasefire and that there should be a release of hostages, which is what we understood also to be the government of Israel's position. So it is a bit surprising and unfortunate that they're not going to apparently attend these meetings.
Additionally, Miller was pressed on the horrifying video that news outlet Al Jazeera released Friday showing what appeared to be an Israeli drone pursuing unarmed Palestinian men and then bombing and killing them. Let's take a look.
I don't know if you see the video or not, but clearly in the video, at least from the way that we see it, they were unarmed, they look civilians, and they were targeted numerous times by rockets from a drone.
So I've seen the video, not able to offer an assessment as to the identity of the individuals in the video or any of the circumstances surrounding it, but it is something that we've asked the Israelis for more information about.
So what happens next? Here to help break it down for us is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome back to the show, Trita.
Thank you for having me.
So what should we make of this resolution passing, not with a U.S. veto, but just an abstention?
It certainly is a step forward. This is the first time that we see that the president's shift in rhetoric in which, they're starting to talk about ceasefire, the need for a ceasefire actually has translated into a change in position. But I think we also have to be very clear. It's a changing position that will be rather meaningless unless there is an effort to make sure that this is implemented. And only the United States has the leverage to be able to press the Israelis to start implementing it. I find it unhelpful and concerning that the administration has gone and made these statements that this resolution is not binding. That is just simply factually incorrect. This is a Chapter 6 resolution. It is part of international law now. It is binding. It doesn't have the force of implementation as it would if it was a Chapter 7 resolution in which the UN would be able to authorize force to essentially force the Israelis to comply with it. It doesn't have that power, but that doesn't mean that it isn't binding. For the administration to say things like this that are just so blatantly incorrect is really unfortunate, not only because it undermines the little bridge building that we saw between the United States and the rest of the international community, it undermines the UN Security Council. What's going to happen next time, Russia invades a country and a resolution is passed and the Russians can say, well, this is not legally binding. But also it really seems to signal a lack of will on the administration side to implement, and that is very problematic. So it's a step forward, but potentially also a step back.
Yeah, Dr. Parsi, it was really remarkable to see immediately after the vote, which, as you noted online, was met with unusual applause in the room, that Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield's remarks indicated that she thought it was non-binding. State Department spokesmembers have repeated that in the day since the vote was held. And you seem to see a kind of a response that seems like a subtweet, if you will, of the United States from Antonio Gutierrez, who says the Security Council just approved a long-awaited resolution on Gaza demanding an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This resolution must be implemented. Failure would be unforgivable. That seems like a direct rebuke to the United States and the Biden administration's implications here that they don't have to do anything about this. But as you mentioned, there's this enforcement issue that's still kind of hanging in the wind. What does this mean now? And why do you think the United States chose to not block this, to abstain, even if they weren't planning, it seems, to do anything to actually implement this resolution?
Well, a couple of things. Those are several very good questions. Let me just first address the thing about what Gutierrez said. That is certainly addressed at President Biden. And there's a background to this as well. There is a sense at the UN and amongst many of the countries at the UN that the US has been systematically sought to undermine and hollow out the UN system and international law and instead replace it with the so-called rules-based international order. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that these two things are the same thing. International law and rules-based order are the same thing. They're not. The international law is centered on the UN system. Rules-based order is centered on what the United States wants. It's a completely different thing. And there is that sense at the UN that the US has been systematically, not just under Trump or some of the very anti-UN presidents, but systematically, even under Democratic presidents, sought to sideline the UN and replace it with the rules-based international order. And the statement that this is not legally binding fits very well into that perception, that narrative, that this is yet another effort by the United States to sideline the U.S., make it weaker, and essentially undermine it. As to the question of why the administration signed on to this now, given the fact that they have vetoed 3 others and it's gone 6 months, I would say that there are 3 factors that I think are most important here. First of all, the domestic political pressure on the Biden administration is starting to have an impact. I would say 2 months ago, there was a lot of confidence in the administration. They thought that this is going to pass. After the uncommitted vote and realizing that this is not going away, I would say they're almost in a state of panic and they're realizing that they have to shift. Secondly, in terms of international pressure, it's very clear. What happened at the UN yesterday was really remarkable, because you had every single one of the non-permanent members of the Security Council joining together on a resolution, deliberately making sure that Russia and China are not co-sponsors of it, just the non-permanent ones. And if you take a list of that, take a look at the list of that non-permanent members, you're talking about 2 of America's strongest Asian allies, South Korea and Japan, 3 European allies from the EU. All of these countries coming together, and essentially what they were doing was daring Biden to veto it now when all of them had signed on to this, essentially saying that you're not just rejecting Russia or China, you're rejecting everyone else in the international system that actually considers you a friend. Are you really going to do that? And I think it just became too costly, even for the Biden administration that otherwise has been willing to accept unlimited cost almost, in terms of the damage to the U.S.'s standing, just for it to be able to stand by Israel as it is continuing its slaughter in Gaza. And I think it simply came too much. And the third factor is the internal divisions inside the Biden administration itself, because it's very clear there's a lot of unhappiness in the administration. It's only at the very, very top that there seems to be this firm willingness to continue on this line. And all of these factors, I think, came together and led to this abstention. But then again, immediately afterwards, the administration seemed to walk that back by falsely claiming that this is a non-binding resolution.
What do you make of Matt Miller's response to the question, the video footage we showed, about that drone attack on those 4 men?
I mean, what can you say? At this point, it's just very clear. The Israelis can do almost anything, and the Biden administration is not going to take a strong position against that. And see what Kirby said at his press briefing as well, essentially saying that Netanyahu is unnecessarily choosing to create a perception of daylight between the United States and Israel. What's wrong if there actually is some daylight between the United States and a government that is now engaged in systematic war crimes? There should be daylight between the United States and such a government. But the Biden administration just seems terrified of having anything that indicates that they're not exactly on the same page as Israel. And that is to the detriment of the United States, without a doubt. It's clearly to the detriment of the people of Palestine, but in the long run, it will also be to the detriment of the people of Israel.
Yeah, to that end, just yesterday, the U.S. found, possibly in response to all of the questioning they've been getting at these national security meetings about whether or not the United States is going to do anything in response to all of the claims of humanitarian crimes committed by the Israeli military. The U.S. found Israel is in compliance with Biden's demands on international law and humanitarian aid, saying, quote, "We have not found them to be in violation either when it comes to the conduct of the war or the provision of humanitarian assistance," the State Department said. Your response?
I think it's quite clear at this point that there's just no credibility in this administration when it comes to these matters. And we see that this is not a decision that anyone is taking seriously or believes is actually based on an assessment of the facts. This is a political decision that has been made by the administration in order for them to be able to continue their policy that for whatever reason they think is the right one. But if the Biden administration doesn't have credibility even in this town, even with members of its own party in the Senate on this matter, then you can only imagine how little credibility the United States as a whole has right now in the Middle East and in any effort for peacemaking and mediation in the Middle East. That's one of the key things I think that has come out of these last few months that I think have not been clear to a lot of people in Washington, but is increasingly becoming clear. The United States simply does not have the credibility and the standing to lead any peacemaking effort in the region going forward. It should be a part of it because it is the most powerful country in the world. It should not lead it, however, because it simply doesn't have the credibility. And everything that he has led for the last 40 years has not led to a success.
Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.